Steve Walters, the CEO of a famous fast food chain, stood behind the counter in his own restaurant, dressed in a plain uniform, staring in disbelief at the scene unfolding before him. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had thought this was just a normal shift, a harmless experiment. But the way the customers were treated, no mistreated, was enough to shake him to the core. As Steve looked around, he saw how a young cashier was being scolded by a manager, a customer shouting at a teenage employee who could barely hold back tears, and another worker being given unfair tasks while others stood around, chatting idly. The chaos, the shouting, and the complete lack of empathy was shocking. Steve had always prided himself on the idea that his fast food chain stood for quality, not just in food but in how people were treated, both customers and employees. But now, he was seeing something entirely different. Wait, did you just call that customer sir, when he was clearly a woman? Are you blind? The manager snapped, pointing aggressively at the trembling cashier. Do it right next time or I'll write you up. Steve's heart raced. He knew this kind of behavior couldn't continue, but what could he do? He was just an ordinary worker here today, pretending to be an employee like everyone else, and he couldn't expose himself as the CEO just yet. What if it was too late? What if this was the way things had always been? His mind raced with questions. How many others were treated this way? How many had walked away with bad experiences, silently suffering? The fear of exposing the truth paralyzed him for a moment, but then, just as a group of laughing teenagers came up to the counter to order, one of them spoke in a mocking tone. I want a Big Mac, extra ketchup, the boy said, waving his hand dismissively. And can you make it quick? Don't want to waste all day for lunch. The cashier, a girl no older than 16, hesitated. She glanced nervously at the screen in front of her, unsure what to do. She was new and hadn't learned the ropes yet, and her manager's eyes were on her, waiting for a mistake to punish. The pressure on the girl was evident, and Steve could see it in her shaking hands. The boy leaned closer to the counter and sneered. What's the matter? Did you forget how to take an order? Get it together. Steve's blood boiled. No one should have to endure this kind of treatment, not here, not anywhere. The girl didn't deserve to be belittled like this. He opened his mouth, ready to step in, but then he froze. What was he going to say? The thought of confronting the manager, the thought of revealing himself, terrified him. What if this ruined everything? What if the entire operation fell apart? Before Steve could make a move, the manager stepped forward with a forced smile plastered on his face. Don't worry about it, Jennifer. We've got it. Just step aside and take a break. The manager's tone was smooth, but Steve could hear the underlying venom in it. The girl quickly stepped back, her eyes downcast as she retreated to the break room. Steve's heart sank. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and he had just witnessed it firsthand. The way employees were treated like tools, the way customers acted like they owned the place, it was all so wrong. Steve shook his head, his thoughts racing. He knew he couldn't let this go on, but he also knew there was no way he could fix things if he didn't fully understand the situation. He needed to be a part of it. He needed to know what it was like for the people who worked here, and what it was like for the customers. But before he could decide what to do next, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Hey you, what are you standing there for? The voice was harsh, coming from the manager who had just spoken to Jennifer. Don't just stand there looking lost. Grab a mop and get to work. The manager was glaring at him now, and Steve's heart skipped a beat. For a split second, he thought he might blow his cover. But then he realized he had to play along. He had to blend in. Right, Steve muttered, grabbing the nearest mop and beginning to clean the floor, hoping that the manager wouldn't ask too many questions. As he moved around the restaurant, mopping the floor in silence, Steve couldn't help but reflect on what he'd just seen. There was no denying it. This was not how things were supposed to be. Something had to change. But what? Just as he was lost in thought, he heard a scream. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Get away from me, a voice yelled, followed by the sound of someone running. Steve's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he dropped the mop and rushed toward the source of the commotion. What was happening? As he turned the corner into the dining area, he saw a customer, a large man in his mid-40s, standing over the young cashier who had just been scolded earlier. He was shouting at her, his face red with anger, his fists clenched. The girl was backed into a corner, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain herself. Are you kidding me? I ordered this food 20 minutes ago, the man roared. This is completely unacceptable. Do you know who I am? The cashier stammered, trying to apologize, but the man wasn't listening. His anger was rising, and Steve could feel the tension in the air. "Hey!" Steve shouted, his voice shaky but firm. He stepped forward, standing between the man and the cashier. "That's enough." The man turned to Steve, sizing him up. For a moment, there was silence. The man looked Steve up and down, his eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, he shoved Steve out of the way, sending him stumbling back. "Mind your own business, buddy," the man sneered. Steve's heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this continue. But now he was trapped. He couldn't reveal who he really was, and he couldn't let the girl get hurt. What would he do next? The tension in the air was thick, like a storm cloud about to burst. Steve staggered back a step, but he didn't take his eyes off the man. His hands trembled with both anger and fear. He couldn't believe what was happening. Here he was, the CEO of a fast food chain, standing in the middle of his own restaurant, powerless to stop an angry customer from bullying one of his employees. The man glared at Steve with disdain, clearly expecting him to back down. But Steve wasn't about to let this go any longer. "Hey, you don't have to do this," Steve said, his voice shaky but resolute. He squared his shoulders, trying to keep his composure. "She's just doing her job. You can't treat her like that." The man let out a bitter laugh. "And who the hell are you to tell me how to treat her?" He stepped forward, his chest puffing up with arrogance. "This is a restaurant, not a daycare. If you can't keep your employees in line, maybe I'll take my business elsewhere." Steve took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The man's words stung, but he couldn't let them distract him. This wasn't about defending his own pride. This was about protecting his employees and creating a better environment for everyone who walked through the door. "I'm serious," Steve continued, keeping his voice firm. "You need to leave if you can't be respectful. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here." The man's face turned red with rage. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You want me to leave? Fine. But don't think you'll get away with this." With a final glare at the cashier, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the restaurant, the door slamming behind him. As soon as he was gone, the atmosphere in the room seemed to deflate. The other customers were murmuring quietly, some looking nervously over at Steve and the cashier. The young girl, still visibly shaken, was standing frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge for support. Steve looked at her, feeling a wave of guilt and regret wash over him. He should have done more. He could have stopped the situation before it escalated, before the man got physical. He walked toward her slowly, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" The girl nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I think so. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Steve felt a pang in his chest. She shouldn't have to apologize. It wasn't her fault. She was just a kid, trying to do her job, caught in the middle of an unreasonable customer's anger. "You didn't cause any trouble," Steve said softly. "You did nothing wrong." She looked at him, her eyes still wide with fear. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." Steve shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. No one should be treated that way, especially not here. This is supposed to be a place where people feel safe, not afraid." For a brief moment, they just stood there, the silence hanging between them. But then, something unexpected happened. The manager who had been watching from the back of the store came forward, clapping his hands loudly. Well. Looks like we have a hero in the building," the manager said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nice job, Steve. Real impressive." Steve turned to face him, his anger flaring once again. He had had enough of the manager's condescending attitude. "What's your problem, Jeff? Why are you acting like it's a joke? That man was out of line, and you saw what was happening. Why didn't you do anything?" Jeff crossed his arms, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "Oh, please. What's the point? People like him don't change, and you can't make everyone happy. Let the customers be rude if they want. That's just how things work." Steve's fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe the words that were coming out of Jeff's mouth. This was the kind of attitude that had led to the toxic environment he had witnessed earlier. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had made him want to see for himself what was really going on behind the scenes. "No," Steve said, his voice firm. "That's not how it works. This is supposed to be a place where people are treated with respect, whether they're customers or employees. You don't just let things slide. That's not what I stand for." Jeff raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, you stand for respect now? I didn't know you were so soft, Steve. You've always been all about profits and numbers, not about this people-first nonsense. The words hit Steve like a slap in the face. Jeff was right about one thing. He had always been focused on the bottom line. But standing here, witnessing the way things were going, he realized that it couldn't be just about money anymore. There had to be more to it than that. "You're wrong," Steve said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'm going to make sure things change. Starting right now." The determination in his voice made Jeff snicker, but Steve wasn't listening. He had made up his mind. He was going to turn this place around, even if it meant challenging the way things had always been done. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Just then, the door to the restaurant opened again, and a couple walked in, looking around curiously. Steve was momentarily distracted, but then he heard the manager's voice again, this time speaking to the young cashier in an almost whisper. "You should be careful next time. Don't let people like him push you around. You're lucky he was here. Most people won't stick their necks out for you." Steve could see the girl's shoulders stiffen as Jeff spoke, and the words stung. They shouldn't have been said. This wasn't the kind of environment he wanted to create. But as the couple approached the counter, the manager's attention shifted away, and Steve had a moment of clarity. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just stand back and wait for things to change. He had to make them change. But first, he needed to understand what it was like to work on the ground level. He needed to step up, not just as a CEO, but as a human being, and lead by example. And that meant getting involved. Without a second thought, Steve grabbed his apron and walked over to the register. "Let me take care of this," he said to the cashier, his voice soft yet determined. "You can take a break. I'll handle it from here." The cashier blinked in surprise, but she nodded gratefully and stepped away. Steve took her place behind the counter, his heart racing. This was his chance, his moment to truly understand what his employees went through every day. But what he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The challenges ahead would test him in ways he never expected. And just as he was about to take the next customer's order, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Steve's heart skipped a beat. What was happening now? Steve turned toward the kitchen, his stomach twisting with anxiety. He had barely taken his position behind the counter, trying to get a feel for the situation, and now there was a loud crash from the back of the restaurant. It wasn't just a small accident. It sounded like something had broken. Maybe a tray of food, or worse, one of the machines had malfunctioned. He hurried toward the source of the noise, pushing through the swinging door that led into the kitchen. The moment he entered, the chaos hit him like a wave. One of the fryers had tipped over, spilling hot oil onto the floor, and in the middle of the mess stood a young man, no older than 19, covered in grease and looking horrified. His eyes were wide with panic, and his hands were shaking as he fumbled with the controls of the fryer, trying in vain to stop the spillage. "What happened?" Steve demanded, rushing forward and grabbing a nearby towel to help clean up. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to," the young man stammered, his voice high with nervousness. "The fryer was acting weird, and when I tried to fix it, I don't know how it tipped over." Steve looked at him, feeling a pang of empathy. He could see the fear in the young man's eyes, the way he was terrified of what would happen next. It was obvious that he was doing his best, but accidents happen, especially in fast-paced environments like this one. "Hey, calm down," Steve said, his voice softer now. "It's okay. We'll get this cleaned up, and no one is going to get in trouble. Just take a step back for a second." The young man nodded, still shaking, and stepped back from the fryer. Steve quickly surveyed the damage. The floor was a mess, but there didn't seem to be any serious harm done. It would take some time to clean up, but it wasn't anything that couldn't be fixed. "Is anyone hurt?" Steve asked, looking around the kitchen. "No, sir, no one's hurt," another employee called out, coming over with a mop and bucket. "Just a bit of a spill. We'll get it cleaned up in no time." Steve breathed a sigh of relief. It could have been worse, but it wasn't. The workers were already on it, and it seemed like the situation was under control. As the team worked to clean up the mess, Steve felt a sense of guilt wash over him. This wasn't just an isolated accident. It was another reminder of how fast-paced and stressful this environment could be. Workers were constantly under pressure to get everything right, and when something went wrong, they were often left to deal with the consequences alone. The company had failed to provide enough support for the people doing the hardest jobs, and that was something he would have to change. He watched as the young man who had caused the accident, still visibly upset, stood off to the side, wringing his hands. Steve walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Hey, listen, Steve said, his voice warm but firm. You did the right thing by trying to fix the fryer. It's not your fault it tipped over. Accidents happen. What matters is that you're safe, and no one was hurt. Don't beat yourself up about it. The young man looked up at Steve, surprised by his calm reassurance. But I've only been here for 2 weeks. I didn't think I'd mess up this bad. You're doing great, Steve reassured him. Every new job has a learning curve. Don't let one mistake make you think you're not doing well. I've been in your shoes before. It's tough, but we all get through it. The young man nodded slowly, clearly feeling a little better. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. Anytime, Steve said with a smile. Now let's get this cleaned up and make sure we're ready for the next shift. As they finished cleaning up the fryer spill and returning things to normal, Steve felt the weight of his decision pressing on him more heavily than ever. He couldn't just sit by and let these things happen. His company had to do better for its employees. It wasn't enough to sit behind a desk and make decisions from afar. He needed to be involved, to understand the daily struggles and stresses of the people who worked for him. But just as he was processing these thoughts, the restaurant's door opened again, and a familiar voice cut through the air. Steve, what the heck is going on in here? Steve turned to see his assistant manager, Sarah, walking toward him with a clipboard in her hand. She was clearly frustrated, her face a mask of tension. Sarah, hey, Steve said, trying to keep things calm. There was just a small accident in the kitchen, but everything's under control now. She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Small accident? There's oil all over the floor, and you're standing here, mopping it up? You're supposed to be in the office doing reports, not cleaning up fryer spills. Steve felt his patience slipping. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture. I'm trying to understand what's going on around here, Sarah. If I'm going to fix things, I need to be involved. This is the kind of stuff I need to see firsthand. Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Fine, but next time, you need to let us handle it. We've got it under control here. Steve nodded, though the tension in the air was thick. He wasn't here to step on anyone's toes. He was just trying to help. But as Sarah turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't on his side. She didn't seem to understand what he was trying to do. It was becoming more and more clear to Steve that making changes in this company was going to be harder than he had imagined. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how entrenched the problems were. It wasn't just about one bad manager or one unfortunate accident. It was a culture that needed to be reshaped from the ground up. But Steve couldn't stop now. He was committed to making a difference, no matter how difficult it got. Just as he turned back to help clean up the last of the mess, the restaurant's front door slammed open again, and in stormed a woman with a furious expression on her face. I've been waiting for over an hour for my food, she yelled, her voice high with anger. This is outrageous. Steve's heart sank. Another problem. And this time, it was personal. The woman's gaze landed on Steve, and her eyes widened with recognition. Wait, aren't you the CEO? What are you doing here? Steve's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the moment he wanted to reveal himself. Not yet. But before he could think of a response, the woman took a step closer, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Well, I'll tell you one thing. If I don't get my food in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling corporate, and you'll be hearing from me. Trust me, this will not go unnoticed. And with that, she stood there, waiting for him to make the next move. What would Steve do? Would he give in to the customer's demands, or would he stick to his principles? The clock was ticking. Steve's mind raced as the woman stood before him, arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to spiral out of control, especially now, with everything already feeling tense. But there was no way around it. He had to deal with this. Ma'am, Steve said, his voice firm but calm, I understand you're frustrated, but raising your voice isn't going to make the situation better. I apologize for the delay, but we're working as fast as we can to serve everyone here. The woman didn't seem to want to hear it. I've been here for an hour, she shot back. And you think I'm just going to sit here and wait some more? This is ridiculous. You're the CEO, right? Well, how about you start acting like one and fix this? Steve didn't flinch, even though every word felt like a slap to the face. He knew she was upset, and honestly, he couldn't blame her. If he were in her shoes, he would be furious too. But her attitude wasn't helping anyone. I get that you're upset, Steve continued, trying to keep his voice level. But please try to understand. There's a lot happening in the kitchen right now. We've had some issues, but I'm doing everything I can to make sure we get your order to you as soon as possible." The woman scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "Yeah, sure. It looks to me like you're just standing around. Maybe if you actually worked instead of hiding behind the counter, we'd all get our food in a timely manner." Steve felt his patience start to wear thin, but he knew that reacting angrily wouldn't help. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to keep things as calm as possible. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said again. "I'll personally make sure your order gets to you as quickly as possible." The woman glared at him for a moment, her eyes filled with distrust. Then, as if finally realizing she wasn't getting the response she wanted, she huffed and turned on her heel, heading back to her table. "You better," she muttered, "or I'll make sure everyone knows how terrible your service is. I'm this close to telling every one of your customers about this." Steve sighed in relief, though the words still stung. He wasn't sure if he'd made things better or just put a temporary band-aid on a much deeper wound. He had tried to appease her, but what if this was a sign that things weren't going to change easily? As the woman sat back down, Steve took a moment to collect himself. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure, not from customers, not from his own staff, and certainly not from his own thoughts. This job, this undercover experience, was proving to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. "Are you okay?" a voice suddenly asked from behind him. Steve turned to find Jennifer, the young cashier he had tried to protect earlier, standing at the edge of the counter. Her face was still pale, but she was watching him with a curious expression. "I'm fine," Steve replied quickly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just trying to make sure everyone is taken care of. You all right?" Jennifer nodded, though she still seemed a little uneasy. "Yeah, I can't believe you actually talked to her like that. She was really rude." Steve gave a soft chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "Sometimes it's the only way. It's part of the job, right?" She smiled, though there was still a trace of nervousness in her eyes. "I guess. I just hope things don't get worse." Steve's thoughts immediately turned to the woman's threat. He couldn't help but wonder how many other customers had felt mistreated or ignored, and how many had walked away with a bad taste in their mouths. He knew he couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about one customer, or even this one incident. It was about the overall experience that everyone was having. If he didn't fix it, nothing would change. "You're doing fine, Jennifer," Steve reassured her, his voice gentle. "Don't let people like her get to you. You've got this." She gave him a small, appreciative smile before retreating to the back to continue with her duties. Steve watched her go, feeling a bit more determined. He needed to make sure she, and everyone else here, felt safe and supported. As he turned back toward the counter to take the next order, a thought crossed his mind. How many people were like Jennifer, trying their best but getting overlooked, or worse, mistreated? How many of them were waiting for someone to stand up for them, someone to show them that they mattered? Suddenly, Steve was struck by the weight of his decision. He wasn't just undercover as a CEO, he was here as a voice for change. His presence in this restaurant wasn't just a random experiment. He had a responsibility to everyone who worked here. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just about fixing small problems here and there. This was about changing the entire culture of the company. He couldn't fix it in one day, or even 1 week. But he could start by being an example, by showing respect, and in turn, encouraging respect among everyone else. Just as he was mulling over these thoughts, a crash from the kitchen interrupted him. Steve's head snapped toward the noise, his stomach dropping. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, rushing to the back once more. When he burst into the kitchen, the scene was even worse than before. This time, it wasn't just an accident. The young man who had caused the fryer spill earlier was standing frozen in place, his eyes wide with panic. On the floor in front of him was a large pot of boiling water, which had spilled and caused a minor burn on his arm. He was trying to stay calm, but his face contorted in pain, and the kitchen staff looked equally unsure of what to do. "Someone get some ice," Steve ordered, rushing to the young man's side. One of the other workers quickly grabbed a towel, soaking it in cold water and pressing it against his burn. But the panic was still in the air. This was another reminder of how dangerous things could get when people weren't properly trained, or when they were pushed beyond their limits. Steve took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Are you okay?" he asked the young man, his voice soft but urgent. I think so," the young man replied, wincing. It hurts a lot." "We'll get you fixed up," Steve said, his mind racing. This was no longer just about poor treatment. This was about safety. It was about ensuring that everyone who worked here went home without injury. But even as he said the words, another loud noise echoed through the restaurant, a customer yelling at the front counter. Steve's pulse quickened. There was no time to lose. He had to handle this, for everyone's sake. What would happen next? Could he fix this mess, or was the company too far gone to save? Steve stood frozen for a moment, looking between the young man's burn and the chaos unfolding at the front of the restaurant. He could feel the pressure mounting on him from all sides. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about preventing further disasters and doing everything he could to keep his employees safe. They needed a leader, and now, more than ever, he had to step up. "Stay with him," Steve said to the other workers who had gathered around the injured employee. "I'm going to take care of the situation out front." He turned on his heel and rushed back to the front of the restaurant. The yelling customer was still going on, his voice carrying through the entire dining area. "I've been waiting for over 30 minutes, the man bellowed, glaring at the counter staff. "This is absolutely unacceptable. What kind of place is this?" Steve approached the counter slowly, trying to stay calm despite the chaos inside. He recognized the man immediately. He was one of the regulars, someone who had come in enough times to make Steve remember his face. But today, the man's behavior was out of line. "Excuse me, sir," Steve said, his voice steady as he stood behind the counter. "I'm Steve Walters, the CEO of this company. I'm sorry about the wait. Can I help you with your order?" The man turned his glare toward Steve, his expression hard. He seemed momentarily surprised that the CEO of the company was standing in front of him, but the surprise quickly turned into more anger. "Yeah, you can start by explaining why I've been waiting so long for food," the man snapped. "What kind of company runs like this? If I wanted bad service, I would have gone to any other fast food chain. At least there I wouldn't have to deal with incompetent employees who can't do their jobs." Steve felt the sting of the man's words. There was no excuse for the delays, but the man's complete lack of respect for the staff was inexcusable. Steve could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, but he kept his voice calm. "I understand your frustration, but this situation is not the fault of the employees. We've had some issues in the back, but we're doing everything we can to fix them. I apologize for the inconvenience, and I'll make sure you get your food as quickly as possible." The man crossed his arms, not convinced. "Yeah, right. You're just saying that because you're the boss. Maybe if you spent more time running this place properly instead of hiding in your office, things would work a lot better around here." Steve's frustration boiled over, but he knew he had to keep it under control. "I'm not hiding in my office," he said, his tone firm. "I'm standing here, right now, trying to make things right. And that means we're going to fix the problem and ensure it doesn't happen again. But I need you to be patient and respectful while we do that. The staff is doing their best." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Whatever. I'm not going to sit here and wait for you to fix your problems. I'll just go somewhere else, and I'll make sure no one I know comes here again." Steve watched as the man stormed out of the restaurant, muttering under his breath. His words stung, but Steve didn't have time to dwell on it. He had a bigger problem on his hands. He needed to make sure the employees weren't caught in the crossfire of customers' frustrations anymore. He turned around and saw Jennifer, the young cashier, watching from a distance. She looked unsure, as though she were waiting for some sort of confirmation that everything would be okay. Steve smiled at her, trying to reassure her, even though he wasn't sure himself. "Take a deep breath," Steve said to her. "Things are a little crazy right now, but we'll get through it." Jennifer nodded, still visibly nervous, but there was a hint of gratitude in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to step up like that, and he knew it had made a difference. He hadn't just stood up for the company, he'd stood up for the people working in it. But as Steve turned back to check on the kitchen, a new wave of panic hit him. Another employee had arrived at the counter, and he could see the look of terror in their eyes. Something wasn't right. "What happened?" Steve asked, stepping toward the employee. The worker was pale, their hands shaking. "There's a huge mess in the kitchen, and the fryer broke. I don't know what to do. It's all falling apart back there, and people are getting hurt." Steve's heart sank. It was worse than he had thought. The kitchen was a disaster zone, and he had no idea how to fix it. The workers were overwhelmed, and now there was the risk of further accidents. The young man who had been injured earlier was still hurt, and the kitchen team was struggling to get a handle on the situation. "Okay, everyone stay calm," Steve said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's get this under control. We'll get the fryer fixed, and we'll make sure the kitchen is safe again. I'll handle this." Steve took a deep breath, trying to steady his own nerves. He wasn't used to managing things like this. He was used to board meetings and high-level decisions, not being in the trenches like this. But this was his responsibility now. He rushed to the kitchen again, pushing through the swinging doors to find the chaos he had expected. The fryer was still smoking, and a few employees were standing around, unsure of what to do next. "Everyone step back," Steve said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Let's get the fire extinguisher, make sure no one gets hurt, and then we'll clean up this mess." He glanced over at the young man who had caused the first fryer spill. The employee was looking at Steve with wide eyes, fear still in his expression. I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Steve's heart softened. This wasn't just about fixing the fryer or cleaning up the mess. It was about making sure the workers felt supported, not scared. He stepped closer to the young man. "Hey," Steve said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. This is just an accident, and accidents happen. The most important thing is that no one's hurt. We'll fix it, all right." The young man nodded slowly, his face still pale but visibly relieved. Steve turned back to the others in the kitchen, directing them to get the fire extinguisher and take the necessary precautions. As they worked together, Steve couldn't help but think about how different the atmosphere felt now. There was tension in the air, yes, but there was also a sense of camaraderie, a feeling that, despite the chaos, they were in this together. And that was what Steve needed to see. He needed to understand that the culture of the restaurant needed to be built on teamwork and respect, not fear and pressure. Just as the fryer was being taken care of and the smoke started to clear, the door to the kitchen swung open once more. A delivery driver walked in, holding a box of supplies. Steve turned to face him, and just for a split second, he thought everything might finally be calming down. But then the delivery driver spoke, and Steve's stomach dropped. "We've got a major issue with the delivery. The order's completely wrong. Half of it's missing, and some of it's damaged. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning." How would Steve handle this one? What could possibly go wrong next? Steve felt a sudden chill run through him. Just when he thought the storm had calmed, another wave came crashing down. The delivery driver's words were a dagger to his already battered resolve. Half of it's missing? Damaged goods? This was exactly what he had feared, too many things going wrong at once. He knew he had to stay calm, but inside, his mind was racing. "All right, let's take a look," Steve said, forcing his voice to stay steady. He walked toward the delivery driver, who was standing at the doorway holding a damaged box. The smell of burnt oil still lingered in the kitchen, mixing with the faint scent of stale fast food. It seemed like everything was falling apart all at once. The delivery driver hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know what happened, man. I checked the order before I left the warehouse, but this doesn't match what I was told to bring." Steve took the box from the driver's hands and opened it. Sure enough, what he saw inside only made the knot in his stomach tighten further. There were boxes of ingredients, but there were also items that didn't belong, broken plastic containers, squished packages of buns, and a variety of other items that were completely wrong for the order. "This is bad," Steve muttered under his breath. He could hear the distant chatter of customers in the dining area, the clink of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter, completely unaware of the mess happening in the kitchen. But how much longer could he keep the front of the house running smoothly while everything in the back was falling apart? He looked at the delivery driver, who was still waiting for his next instruction. "Do you have a way to get back to the warehouse quickly?" The delivery driver nodded. "I can head back, but it's going to take a while. Probably about an hour. You know how it is during rush hour. The traffic's awful." Steve's mind spun as he weighed his options. Another hour of delay would only make things worse. He needed that order. He needed it now. He looked around the kitchen, thinking quickly. There had to be something he could do. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Steve said, finally making a decision. "You're going to go back and get the right items. I'm going to take care of the kitchen. And in the meantime, I'll call the other stores and see if they have what we need in stock. We'll work together to make sure no one notices the problem at the front." The delivery driver nodded, clearly relieved that Steve had a plan. "All right, I'll head out now. Be back as soon as I can." As soon as the delivery driver left, Steve turned back to the kitchen, where the team was still working on cleaning up the mess from the fryer incident. The burn had been treated, but the atmosphere was still tense. Steve could feel the pressure mounting, but he refused to let it break him. He was the one who had to hold things together now. "All right, everyone," Steve said, trying to sound confident. "We've got a situation on our hands, but we're going to handle it. We're short some supplies, and we need to make sure the customers don't know anything is wrong. We're going to work smarter, not harder. Let's double-check the inventory, see what we have, and get the orders out without anyone noticing the delays." Jennifer, who had been quietly standing by the counter, nodded. "Got it. I'll go check the pantry and see if we have extra of anything we can use." Steve looked at her, giving her a nod of approval. "Perfect. Let's stay calm and stay focused. If we all pull together, we can fix this. We've handled worse, right?" She smiled, though it was faint. "Yeah, we've got this." The team spread out, working quickly to make do with what they had. They pulled ingredients from the shelves, rearranged the stock, and started to prep food in ways that they hadn't been trained for. The kitchen was full of frantic energy, but there was also a growing sense of camaraderie. Everyone was pulling their weight. Steve couldn't help but feel proud of them. Despite everything that had gone wrong, they were stepping up and making the best of a bad situation. But just as things were starting to feel somewhat under control, Steve heard another crash. This time, it came from the storage room. Steve's heart skipped a beat. What now? What could possibly go wrong next? He didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the storage room, pushing through the swinging door to find a young worker, barely out of high school, standing amidst a mess of spilled crates and fallen bags of flour. The worker's face was flushed with embarrassment, and he was frozen in place, staring at the disaster in front of him. I didn't mean to," the young man stammered, his voice filled with guilt. I tripped over the bag, and everything came tumbling down. I swear, I didn't mean to." Steve closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. It seemed like everything was falling apart at once. Another mess, another accident. It would be so easy to lose control, to let the stress overwhelm him. But he couldn't. He couldn't let the team see him falter. They were looking to him for leadership now, and he had to lead by example. Hey, it's okay," Steve said, his voice gentle as he approached the young worker. "Accidents happen. You didn't do anything wrong." "But it's a huge mess," the young man said, his eyes wide with worry. "How are we going to fix this?" "We'll clean it up," Steve said firmly, taking control of the situation. "It's not the end of the world. We've been through worse, right? We've got this. Everyone just needs to stay calm and pitch in. We can do it together." The young man nodded, still looking a little shaken, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Steve smiled and gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "All right," Steve said, standing tall. "Let's get to work." They quickly began cleaning up the mess, the workers all pitching in, and the kitchen started to regain some order. The smell of burnt oil and flour filled the air, but now there was also the smell of determination. They weren't going to let this ruin their day. It was a long, hard hour, but eventually they managed to get the kitchen back in order. Steve stood back, surveying the progress. The fryer was working again, the storage room was cleaned up, and the supplies were on their way. They'd done it. They'd weathered the storm, together. Just as Steve was about to breathe a sigh of relief, Jennifer came up to him, looking flustered. "Steve," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you. A lot of the customers are starting to complain about the food being cold, and some of them are even asking for their money back." Steve's heart dropped again. He had been so focused on the chaos behind the scenes, he hadn't even thought about the front of the house. The customers were starting to feel the ripple effects of the delays, and now the pressure was on. The clock was ticking, and Steve knew that if he didn't act quickly, this situation could spiral out of control. What was he going to do? How could he fix this mess before it got worse? The storm wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. Steve's heart raced as Jennifer's words sank in. Customers were starting to complain about cold food, and some were even asking for their money back. The weight of the situation hit him harder than anything else. In the kitchen, they had managed to control the chaos, but the ripple effect had reached the dining area. If they didn't fix this fast, it could turn into a full-blown disaster. People would leave, and worse, they might never come back. "All right," Steve said, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Let's go. We're going to fix this, but we need to move quickly." Jennifer gave him a nervous glance. "How are we going to do that? The kitchen's already behind. I don't know how much more we can do." Steve knew she was right. The kitchen was still behind, and the delivery wasn't due back for another 40 minutes. But that didn't mean they were out of options. He needed to keep the customers calm, or they would turn the whole restaurant into a pressure cooker ready to explode. "We're going to keep the customers informed," Steve said, trying to inject a little more confidence into his voice than he felt. "I'll handle the complaints at the counter. You, Jennifer, take over the front and make sure the other cashiers know what's going on. We'll be transparent, but we'll also stay calm. We're a team, and teams support each other." Jennifer nodded, though the worry in her eyes was still visible. She had only been working here for a couple of months, and this was nothing like anything she'd expected to face. But Steve could see the determination in her as she turned to walk to the front counter. Steve turned to face the dining area, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was part of this team, and his actions were going to set the tone for the rest of the night. The customers needed someone to take charge, and it might as well be him. He walked toward the counter, where a disgruntled customer was already tapping their foot impatiently, arms crossed. Steve approached them with a calm smile, doing his best to hide his own nervousness. "Good evening," Steve said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm Steve Walters, the CEO of this company. I understand you've been waiting a while, and I sincerely apologize for the delay. We're experiencing some unexpected issues in the kitchen right now, but I promise we're doing everything we can to get your food out as soon as possible." The customer's expression softened slightly, but they didn't look entirely convinced. "Yeah, well, I've been waiting for my burger for 30 minutes. And you're the CEO? Shouldn't you be running things better than this?" Steve felt a flash of frustration, but he kept his face neutral. "I completely understand your frustration. This isn't the experience we want for our customers. But we are working to fix it, and if you'd like, I can offer you a complimentary meal or a discount for the inconvenience." The customer raised an eyebrow, seemingly surprised by the offer. "A discount, huh? I guess that'll have to do." Steve nodded, pulling up the system on the register and applying the discount as promised. "Thank you for your understanding," he said, handing the customer their receipt. "I can assure you, we're doing everything we can to get the food out as quickly as possible." The customer took the receipt, but didn't say another word. Steve could see the tension in their posture, but he hoped that offering a solution, even a small one, had helped. As the customer walked away, Steve turned to the next person in line, offering them the same apologies and reassurances. Each customer was different. Some were understanding, others less so, but Steve kept his cool, trying to manage each situation with patience and empathy. He could feel the anxiety building in his chest, but he refused to let it show. The team was counting on him, and the customers needed to see that they were in good hands. After handling a few more complaints, Steve looked over at Jennifer, who was standing by the door with a tablet, speaking to customers. She was calm, even when faced with angry faces and frustrated voices. Her confidence seemed to be growing with every moment. "You're doing great," Steve said to her, as he approached her after speaking with a particularly grumpy customer. Jennifer gave him a small smile, though it was still tinged with concern. "I just feel like we're running out of time. The kitchen's still behind, and the customers are getting angrier." Steve felt the knot in his stomach tighten again. The pressure was mounting from all sides. But they had made it this far, and they couldn't afford to back down now. "We'll get through it, Jennifer. Just keep communicating with them. They need to know we're working on it, and that we care about getting it right. The kitchen will catch up soon." Jennifer nodded, but before Steve could say anything more, a sudden crash from the kitchen caught his attention. His heart stopped for a moment. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, already turning back toward the kitchen. The scene that greeted him when he entered was worse than he could have imagined. The young man who had been injured earlier was standing by the fryer, his face pale and sweaty. But this time, there was no burn to tend to. Instead, it was the fryer itself that had exploded. Well, not literally, but enough to cause the oil inside to spill all over the floor again, and the heat was so intense that a part of the fryer had actually caught fire. "Everyone get back," Steve yelled, his voice sharp as he rushed to the nearest fire extinguisher. The last thing they needed now was another disaster. He grabbed the extinguisher, spraying it over the small flames, and the fire was quickly put out, but the mess left behind was catastrophic. "Is everyone okay?" Steve asked, looking around frantically. The workers were all stepping back, their faces grim but thankfully unharmed. One of the workers spoke up, his voice shaking. "It's the wiring in the fryer. We've been having problems with it for weeks, but nobody fixed it. The thing was just waiting to go." Steve closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the full extent of what was happening. This wasn't just an accident. It was a result of neglect, of not fixing the small problems before they became big ones. "All right, no more delays," Steve said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We need a new fryer, and we need it now. I'll call the supplier myself. And in the meantime, we'll move forward with what we've got. We're not letting this stop us." As Steve moved to make the call, his mind raced. This was a turning point. He knew he couldn't keep patching things up one problem at a time. He had to make real changes, big changes. The employees needed better training, better equipment, and better management. It was clear now more than ever that the status quo wasn't working. But the clock was ticking. The customers were still waiting. And Steve didn't have much time to figure out how he was going to fix everything. The next move had to be decisive. As he hung up the phone, Jennifer approached him again, looking concerned. "Steve, the customers are really starting to get upset. Some are even threatening to leave if they don't get their food in the next 10 minutes. What are we going to do?" Steve took a deep breath. There was no more room for error. The storm had finally reached its peak. He turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "We're going to make it right. Trust me. We'll turn this around. This isn't over yet." And with that, the real test began. Would they make it through this night? Or was it too late to fix everything? Steve's thoughts raced as he looked out across the restaurant. The chaos from the back of the kitchen had seeped into the dining area. The hum of low conversations had turned into loud murmurs of frustration, punctuated by the occasional raised voice. He could see Jennifer standing by the counter, trying her best to keep the customers calm. But even from here, Steve could tell that it was only a matter of time before the situation spiraled out of control. He quickly walked toward her, trying to stay composed despite the overwhelming sense of pressure on his shoulders. The fryer was still down, and while he'd managed to secure a replacement, it would take at least an hour to install it. That was an hour that they didn't have. The customers were angry, the employees were running on empty, and everything was hanging by a thread. "Jennifer," Steve said, his voice steady but urgent, "I need you to take the lead here. Let the customers know the food is coming. Give them an update. We can't afford to let them feel ignored." Jennifer nodded, but her eyes betrayed the anxiety she was trying to hide. "I'll do my best, Steve, but I'm not sure how much longer we can keep them from walking out. Some people are starting to get really loud." Steve gave her a brief smile, trying to reassure her. "You've got this. Just stay calm and keep moving. I'll handle the kitchen." As Jennifer moved toward the counter to speak with another group of disgruntled customers, Steve turned back to the kitchen. The smell of burnt oil still lingered in the air, and the last thing he wanted was to add more stress to his already frazzled workers. But there was no avoiding it. They needed to get the fryer up and running, fast. He approached the head cook, who was in the process of sweeping up the remains of the fryer mess. The cook looked up at him, sweat beading on his forehead. "Steve, we've got to get that fryer back in action," the cook said, his voice tight with frustration. "The orders are piling up, and without it, we can't get through even half of them. It's going to be chaos if we don't fix it soon." Steve placed a hand on the cook's shoulder, trying to keep things under control. I know. I've got a new one coming in, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, we need to think outside the box. What can we do to keep the orders moving without the fryer?" The cook paused for a moment, thinking. Then his eyes lit up. "Well, we can make more salads, wraps, and sandwiches. We've got the ingredients for that. We'll just have to put a hold on the fried items for now. It won't be the same, but it'll buy us some time." Steve nodded, impressed by the cook's quick thinking. "All right, let's do that. Let's pivot and get those orders out. We'll focus on the non-fried options until the new fryer is in place." As Steve turned to leave the kitchen, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fryer was just the beginning. The real problem was the culture of the place. The disorganization, the lack of proper training, the management issues, it all led to this point. He knew it wouldn't be fixed in a single day, but something had to change. Fast. Just as he was about to step back into the dining area, he noticed a familiar face in the doorway. Sarah, the assistant manager. Her expression was tight with concern. "Steve," she said, walking up to him, "I need to talk to you. The customers are getting louder, and a couple of them are threatening to call corporate. What are we doing to make this right?" Steve sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm doing everything I can, Sarah. The new fryer is on its way, and we're getting the orders out with the non-fried items in the meantime. But I need your help. We need to keep the front of the house under control. Let the customers know we're doing everything we can. No more surprises. We need them to feel like we're working for them, not against them." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll go out there and talk to them, keep them calm. But you've got to promise me that we'll get this fixed." Beat them. They had come this far, and they could push through this last hurdle. But just as he began to breathe a little easier, a loud crash rang out from the back storage area. Steve's blood ran cold. What now? He rushed toward the sound, pushing through the narrow hallways of the restaurant, trying to ignore the sense of dread that crept over him. As he entered the storage area, he found a disaster waiting for him. A stack of boxes had fallen over, and the impact had caused the boxes to spill open, scattering bottles of sauces and condiments across the floor. Worse, several of the bottles had broken, spilling sticky sauce everywhere. "Who did this?" Steve demanded, his voice firm but controlled. One of the workers, a quiet young man who had only been with the company for a few weeks, was standing in the middle of the mess, his face pale with panic. I'm sorry," the worker said, his voice trembling. "I was just trying to restock the shelves, but the boxes were too high, and when I went to reach them, everything fell." Steve closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. This was exactly the kind of mistake that could send everything spiraling out of control. But there was no time for anger. No time for blame. There was only one thing left to do. "All right, it's okay," Steve said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We'll clean this up. Grab the mop and get to work. We'll need to get these sauces out of here, and we'll need a new order of condiments tomorrow." The young man nodded, looking relieved to hear Steve's response. Together, they began cleaning up the mess, but Steve couldn't shake the feeling that this was the culmination of everything that had been wrong with the restaurant. The disorganization, the lack of proper systems, the poor training, it was all coming to a head. He had been too focused on fixing things in the moment, patching things up, dealing with one crisis after another. But this wasn't about putting out fires. It was about building a better, more efficient company, a place where his employees weren't just scrambling to survive day by day. As Steve finished cleaning up the storage room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, only to see a message from the delivery company. "The fryer has arrived and is being installed as we speak." Steve exhaled deeply, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Now all he had to do was get through the next 30 minutes, keep the team motivated, and make sure the customers stayed happy. It was the final stretch. They could make it. But what would happen when they reached the finish line? Would everything be fixed, or was the damage too great to repair? The storm wasn't over. But for the first time that day, Steve felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it through. As Steve stood in the storage room, mopping up the mess of spilled sauces and condiments, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The fryer was on its way, the kitchen was slowly getting under control, and yet there was a part of him that knew this was just a temporary solution. It felt like they were patching up a sinking ship instead of fixing the root cause of the problem. He'd worked so hard to keep everything moving, to make sure the team didn't lose hope, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming truth. The system was broken. The way the kitchen was run, the way the staff was treated, the way everything depended on him to keep it all together, it was unsustainable. But as he finished cleaning the last of the spilled sauces, he heard a familiar voice at the door. "Steve, the fryer's in place," Jennifer said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "They've got it hooked up. It should be good to go." Steve felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with the reality that it wasn't just about the fryer. It was about the bigger picture. It was about making sure the team could rely on systems that worked, making sure that everyone from the kitchen staff to the frontline employees felt supported. It was about creating an environment where things didn't just fall apart at the first sign of trouble. "Thanks, Jennifer," Steve said, giving her a tired smile. "I'm glad it's finally in. Let's get this show back on the road." As he stepped back into the kitchen, he was met with a wave of relief from the crew. The new fryer hummed to life, and the order tickets started rolling in at a steady pace. The food was finally starting to move, and the tension in the kitchen began to lift. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. But Steve knew there was still work to be done. As he watched the workers moving efficiently now, his mind wandered to the larger issues at hand. The disorganization, the lack of training, the way his employees had been treated. It wasn't enough to just fix the fryer. He needed to fix the culture, the way people worked together, the systems that kept things running smoothly. That was going to take time. But it had to start now. He walked back into the dining area, where Sarah was handling the crowd, and approached her with a purposeful stride. "How's it going out here?" he asked, trying to gauge the mood. Sarah gave him a tired but relieved smile. "A lot better now that the fryer's up and running. Some of the customers are still a little upset, but most of them are understanding now. I've been giving out discounts and free drinks to keep people happy." Steve nodded, thankful for her level-headedness. "Thanks, Sarah. You've been a huge help today. But we can't keep relying on discounts to keep customers from leaving. We need to fix the real issues." Sarah looked at him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Steve hesitated for a moment, thinking about how to explain everything that had been going wrong. "The way we operate, the way the kitchen runs, the way employees are treated, it's all been so disorganized. We've been putting out fires every day, but it's not sustainable. We need systems, training, better communication. It's not just about fixing the fryer or putting out complaints. It's about creating a place where everyone, employees and customers alike, feel like things are working the way they should." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "You're right. Things have been off for a while now. I've been trying to manage it, but it's hard when there's no real structure. People don't know what's expected of them. And the way the team's been treated, it's no wonder they're always on edge." Steve took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the realization sink in. "I know, and I've been part of the problem. I've been so focused on the numbers, on pushing things forward, that I didn't see how broken it really was. But we're going to change that. From now on, we're going to build a system that works for everyone. We're going to train our staff, improve communication, and make sure everyone feels valued. No more shortcuts." Sarah looked at him with a new sense of determination. "I'm in. Let's do this." As Steve looked around at the team, working together to get the orders out, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe they could fix it, piece by piece. The road ahead would be tough, and it would take time, but he knew that they could make a real difference if they worked together. The sound of a bell ringing at the counter broke his thoughts, signaling the arrival of another order. Steve turned to look at the kitchen crew, where the orders were finally moving smoothly. "We're doing it," he murmured to himself, "one step at a time." But just as he was about to go back into the kitchen and take charge of the next batch of orders, the door swung open and a customer stormed in, their face flushed with anger. "I want to speak to the manager, right now," the customer shouted, causing a few heads to turn. Steve froze, his heart skipping a beat. This was the last thing they needed. Was this the breaking point? Would the customer's complaints tear everything down now that they were so close to getting things back on track? He took a deep breath, walked up to the counter, and met the customer's gaze. He couldn't back down now. "I'm Steve Walters," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the CEO of this company. What seems to be the problem?" The customer scowled, clearly agitated. "I've had enough. I waited for over an hour for my food, and when it finally came, it was cold. I've never been so disappointed in a place before. This is unacceptable." Steve nodded, his mind racing. The last thing he needed was a complaint to send things spiraling again. But this was his chance to make it right, to show the customer that the restaurant was changing, that they were committed to providing the best service possible. "I completely understand your frustration," Steve said, meeting the customer's eyes. "This has been a tough day for us, but we're working hard to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'd like to offer you a full refund, along with a voucher for your next meal here. And I'll personally ensure that your next experience with us is a much better one." The customer hesitated for a moment, clearly taken aback by Steve's calm and thoughtful response. After a beat, they sighed, rubbing their temples. "I just don't understand how a place like this can run like this. It's been chaos in here." Steve nodded again, empathizing with the frustration. "I get it. We've had some serious issues behind the scenes, but we're actively working to fix them. I promise we're taking steps to improve, and I appreciate your patience." The customer's posture softened slightly. "All right, I'll give you another chance. But I better not have to deal with this again." Steve smiled, relieved that he had managed to calm the situation. "Thank you. I promise we'll make it right." As the customer left, Steve couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. The day had been full of setbacks, but they were still standing, still pushing forward. It wasn't over yet, but Steve knew one thing for sure. They could make it through this. As he watched the kitchen crew working together, Steve realized that the true test wasn't how quickly they could fix the problems. It was how they responded in the face of adversity, how they worked together, how they learned from their mistakes, and how they rebuilt something better from the ground up. And maybe, just maybe, they were finally on the path to something greater. But the journey was far from over. The evening was far from over, but as Steve stood at the front of the restaurant, watching the crew work together, he felt a flicker of hope. Despite the chaos, despite the setbacks, they were still moving forward. The orders were finally starting to flow, and the kitchen was running like a well-oiled machine. For the first time that day, the restaurant had a semblance of normalcy. However, Steve knew this was just the beginning. There were still cracks in the foundation. Things were improving, but they weren't fixed yet. The way the staff had been treated, the lack of structure, the pressure from higher-ups to hit numbers at any cost, it all needed to be addressed. And that wasn't something that would happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and most importantly, trust. As Steve glanced over at Jennifer, who was now working the front with renewed confidence, he felt a sense of pride in how far they had come. She had stepped up in ways that he hadn't expected, handling the angry customers, keeping everything under control. She wasn't just a cashier anymore. She was a leader in her own right. Sarah, too, was proving to be invaluable. She'd been keeping everything running smoothly at the front, while Steve focused on managing the kitchen chaos. Her communication skills, her ability to stay calm under pressure, she was a cornerstone of what would help this place turn around. But even with the progress they had made, a part of Steve couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that still needed to be done. The employees had been working hard, but they were all running on fumes. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the way they were trying to hold it together, even though the day had been one disaster after another. "Steve," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, and he turned to see her walking toward him, a worried expression on her face. "I just got off the phone with the supplier. They're saying that the new fryer has a problem with the wiring. It could be another hour before they can send someone to fix it." Steve's stomach dropped. Just when things had started to feel like they were back on track, another obstacle. He forced himself to stay calm, though inside, the pressure was building. An hour was a long time when the restaurant was already behind. They couldn't afford another delay. "All right," Steve said, his voice steady. "We'll work around it. I'll talk to the kitchen and let them know to continue focusing on the non-fried items for now. We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got this." Sarah nodded, but Steve could see the concern on her face. "What about the customers? They're starting to get a little restless again." Steve took a deep breath, rubbing his hand over his face. "We keep them informed. We keep showing them we're working hard to fix the issues. They need to feel like they're being heard. We can't afford to lose any more customers tonight." Sarah looked at him for a moment, as if weighing her options. Then, without another word, she turned and headed back to the front. Steve watched her go, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. But just as he was about to walk back into the kitchen, he heard another voice behind him. "Steve, we've got a problem." It was Jennifer, her voice filled with tension. "A group of customers is refusing to pay for their meal. They're saying they shouldn't have to pay for food that was cold when it arrived. What do we do?" Steve's stomach dropped once more. He had anticipated complaints, but not this. If the group refused to pay, it could escalate into something bigger. "Okay," Steve said, walking over to the counter where the group of customers was seated. His mind was working quickly, trying to come up with a way to handle the situation. He couldn't afford to have another confrontation. "I'll take care of it." As he approached the table, he saw the group, 3 adults and 2 children, sitting with arms crossed, clearly unhappy. One of them, a woman in her 30s, looked up at him as he approached. "Are you the manager?" she asked, her voice laced with irritation. "I'm Steve Walters, the CEO," Steve replied, trying to keep his tone calm and respectful. "I understand there's an issue with your meal, and I'd like to make it right. What seems to be the problem?" The woman looked him over, as if evaluating whether he was worth her time. "The food came out cold, and it took forever to get to our table. My kids were starving, and we didn't even get what we ordered. This is ridiculous. We're not paying for it." Steve nodded, acknowledging her frustration. "I completely understand. We've had some issues with the kitchen today, and I'm really sorry you had to experience that. But I want to assure you, we're working hard to resolve the situation." The woman crossed her arms tighter. "That doesn't make a difference. We shouldn't have to pay for food that wasn't prepared properly. And you should be doing more to fix it, not just telling us it's being worked on. Steve felt a wave of frustration building inside him. He wasn't the one who had caused the delays, but now it was on him to fix everything. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. I understand, Steve said slowly, and I do want to make things right. So, here's what I'm offering. I'll take care of your meal, no charge, and we'll provide you with a voucher for a free meal next time you come in. I hope that we can prove to you that this isn't the standard we set. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she processed his offer. The tension in the air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Then, finally, she spoke. All right, we'll accept the offer. But we won't be back unless things change. Steve nodded, grateful that he hadn't lost another customer. Thank you. We're committed to making things right, and I hope you'll give us another chance. As the group left, Steve couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had managed to keep the peace, but it was clear that the restaurant was still on the edge. One wrong move, one more complaint, and it could all come crashing down. He walked back to the kitchen, where he saw Jennifer, Sarah, and the rest of the staff continuing to push forward. They had all been through a lot today, and the night wasn't over yet. The fryer was still down, the issues weren't fully resolved, and there were still more customers to serve. But Steve knew that the key to getting through this wasn't just about fixing the immediate problems. It was about creating a culture of trust, of teamwork, and of commitment to improvement. And as he watched his team, he realized that they were on the right path. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more obstacles ahead. But they had survived this day together, and they would continue to push through. But the real question now was, how long would it take before the next storm hit? And when it did, would they be ready? There was only one way to find out. The night felt like it was dragging on forever. Despite the smooth flow of orders that Steve had helped to facilitate with his team, there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. The kitchen was functional again, but the issues hadn't been fully resolved. The fryer was still waiting for the final wiring fix, and Steve knew that it wouldn't take much for things to tip back into chaos. Jennifer was walking around the dining area, checking on tables, and Sarah was still holding down the front, keeping the peace with a graciousness that Steve couldn't help but admire. He could see her talking to customers, explaining the situation without backing down. She was a rock, and Steve appreciated her more than he could express. But even with everything working as best as it could under the circumstances, he could tell his team was running on empty. The employees were giving everything they had, but there was only so much they could do with the pressure mounting. The exhaustion was beginning to show. People were moving slower, their faces strained, their smiles a little more forced. The store had been in crisis mode for hours, and Steve could see how it was starting to wear on everyone. As Steve checked in with the kitchen again, the cook, one of the most reliable team members, approached him with a concerned look. Steve, we've got another problem, the cook said, his voice low. We're running low on some of the supplies. If we don't get more stock soon, we won't be able to finish the orders properly. I don't think we can keep up with this much longer. Steve felt a jolt of panic. They had already gone through so much today, and now this? The last thing he wanted was another supply issue to compound their problems. If the kitchen was stretched any thinner, the cracks would begin to show, and that might be the tipping point that ruined everything. Okay, don't worry. We'll handle it, Steve said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'll call the supplier and see if they can rush an order. We're not letting this slide. But deep down, he knew that this was yet another small failure in a series of larger, systemic problems. The team was doing their best with what they had, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't how a successful operation should run, and Steve felt the weight of that realization like a ton of bricks. He stepped away from the cook and made his way back to the office. He needed to make a call and get the supplies on the way, but his mind was still buzzing with everything else that had gone wrong today. It wasn't just about fixing things in the moment. It was about creating real, lasting change. He couldn't just patch things up anymore. He needed to fix the entire structure of how things worked at this restaurant. Steve sat down in front of his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard as he prepared to make the call to the supplier. But before he could dial the number, he heard the door to the office open. He looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her face drawn with concern. "Steve, I need to talk to you," she said softly. Steve motioned for her to sit, already sensing the gravity of what was coming. "What's going on?" Sarah took a seat, her hands folding in her lap as she looked at him. "It's the staff. I've been talking to a few of them, and, well, they're starting to talk about leaving." They're tired, Steve. They're doing everything they can, but there's only so much they can take. They don't feel like there's any real support from higher up. It's like we're putting out fires every single day. Steve's heart sank. He had known the staff was under a lot of pressure, but he hadn't realized just how deep the frustration ran. To hear that they were considering leaving, it was a slap in the face. It was a sign that the problems weren't just isolated to the kitchen or the customers. It was deeper. It was systemic. The team didn't feel like they had a future here. They were burned out and disillusioned. "I understand," Steve said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "I know things have been rough. I've seen it myself today. But we can't afford to lose anyone, Sarah. We need to make real changes. We need to change the way we treat the staff, the way we manage this place. It's not just about getting food out the door. It's about building a strong, healthy environment where people want to work, where they feel respected." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I agree. But it has to come from the top down, Steve. The leadership needs to change. We can't keep doing this dance where we're constantly reacting to the problems instead of preventing them. People need to know there's a plan, that there's something more than just putting out fires. We need to invest in the team, not just in the food." Steve knew she was right. It wasn't enough to fix the day-to-day issues anymore. He needed to create a long-term solution, a sustainable model that allowed the team to thrive. But that was going to take work. It was going to take time. As the meeting ended and the staff went back to their shifts, Steve stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a real shot at making it. The storm hadn't just passed, it had been weathered. And now it was time to rebuild. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work, long hours, and relentless determination. Steve had spent every waking moment in the restaurant, side by side with his team. The changes they were making were far from perfect, but they were real. Every small improvement built on the last, and slowly but surely, the cracks in the foundation started to mend. The restaurant was quieter these days, but not in a bad way. The frenetic pace of the previous weeks had subsided, replaced by a sense of steadiness that Steve hadn't realized they had been missing. The staff seemed less tense, more in sync. They were working together, not just as a group of individuals, but as a true team. Steve had implemented a few key changes in the structure. First, he had brought in an experienced consultant to help with training the team on better kitchen systems. The training wasn't perfect. There were hiccups along the way, and some days felt like they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But the feedback from the team had been overwhelmingly positive. The systems were clearer, the roles more defined, and the expectations better communicated. The team felt like they had a roadmap, something they could rely on, and that had made all the difference. He had heard from Jennifer about how the front of the house was running much smoother now. She was no longer just handling complaints and trying to keep customers happy. She was actively training new cashiers, helping them find their feet. And it was working. Newer employees felt more confident and engaged because they had the support they needed. As for Sarah, she was more than just a manager. She had become a leader in her own right, taking on more responsibility and helping to implement some of the biggest changes. She was the glue that held the front and back of the house together, and Steve couldn't have asked for a better ally. They'd talked about expanding the management team, bringing in a few more experienced leaders to help share the load, and it seemed like they were on the verge of making that happen. The biggest change, however, was how the team had started to feel about the restaurant. It was no longer just a job, it was a place they wanted to be, a place they felt proud of. The morale had shifted dramatically. It wasn't perfect yet, but the burnout that had plagued them just a few short weeks ago was starting to lift. They were all in it together, and that sense of unity had brought them closer than Steve could have imagined. One Friday afternoon, a month after the team had first sat down to discuss the changes they were working toward, Steve stood by the front counter, looking out at the bustling dining room. The usual Friday rush was in full swing, but it wasn't chaos this time. It was controlled, organized, and calm. People were talking and laughing. The staff was moving fluidly, almost effortlessly, between the kitchen and the counter. There were still small hiccups, but the days of scrambling to keep things together were behind them. Jennifer walked up to him, a proud smile on her face. "I can't believe how far we've come. It's almost like we're a whole new restaurant." Steve smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "We've still got work to do, but we've made it this far together. I couldn't have done it without all of you." Jennifer paused for a moment, watching the team at work. You've really turned things around. The way the team feels about working here, it's completely different. People are happier, more engaged. It's like they believe in this place again. Steve's smile faltered slightly as he thought about the journey they'd been through to get here. I still feel like there's so much more to do. But I guess this is what it's all about. Showing up day after day. Taking it one step at a time. Jennifer nodded. Yeah, I think we've learned that the hard way. But we're finally starting to see the fruits of that labor. And it feels good. Just then, Sarah approached, her clipboard in hand, her usual focused look replaced by a hint of excitement. Steve, Sarah said, her voice full of energy. I've got great news. The district manager wants to come by for a surprise visit next week. Steve raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. A surprise visit? You think they're expecting everything to be perfect? Sarah shrugged. Maybe, but I think we've earned this visit. We're not perfect, but we're making real strides, and they're going to see it. Steve felt a surge of nervous energy. The district manager's visit was important. It would be an opportunity to show that the changes weren't just a short-term fix, they were sustainable. They had to prove that the progress they had made was more than just a flash in the pan. But despite the nerves, he felt proud. This was a test, yes, but it was also proof of how far they had come. We've worked hard to get here, Steve said, more to himself than to Sarah or Jennifer. We've earned this. Let's show them what we've got. As the team continued to work, Steve couldn't help but reflect on everything they had accomplished. When he had first started working alongside them, the atmosphere was thick with frustration, exhaustion, and distrust. Now there was a sense of camaraderie in the air. The employees cared about each other, and they cared about the restaurant. Steve knew that no single person could claim the success. It had been a team effort. From the front of the house to the back, from Jennifer's leadership to Sarah's persistence, and from the hard-working cooks to the new cashiers, it was all about trust. And that trust had made all the difference. But the district manager's visit was still looming. It was a big moment, one that could either validate their progress or reveal their weaknesses. Steve had made promises to the team, and now he had to keep them. He would need to stay calm, focused, and most importantly, he would need to continue showing the team that their hard work mattered. As the evening wore on, Steve stayed in the background, making sure everything went smoothly and watching his team do what they had been working so hard to do. There was a sense of satisfaction in the air, but Steve knew that this was just another step in the journey. The future of the restaurant was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like they were headed in the right direction. And that, he thought, was enough.